Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Friedenthal. I am the founder and CEO of Tolerisk. For those of you not familiar with Tolerisk, we provide risk tolerance technology designed specifically for the fiduciary process. So it's not just a personality profile, but also incorporates financial data to measure your client's mathematical ability or capacity to take risk. We've just released our brand new, completely redesigned site last weekend. So if you haven't seen Tolerisk recently, please reach out to us. We are happy to schedule a demonstration so you can see how advisors use Tolerisk to accelerate practice growth and reduce compliance risk. I think everybody knows the drill by now, given the size of this group. Everybody's phone is muted. However, you are strongly encouraged to type your questions in the chat box. I will be relaying your questions to David, and I'll be interjecting as we go. This is going to keep things more interactive, which we all prefer. I am very proud to introduce our thought leader speaker for this afternoon. Dr. David Blanchett is head of retirement research at PGIM, that's Prudential's asset management division. He's former head of retirement research at Morningstar. He's got 2 master's degrees and a PhD in personal financial planning. He's published a ton of papers. I don't know the specific number. And today he is going to talk about retirement, how retirement planning tools need to evolve. This topic is near and dear to us at Tolerisk, where we've pioneered innovations to account for evolving risk directives, dynamic withdrawal rates, and variable lifespan. I am very excited to hear what David's going to share with us today. So without further ado, welcome, David Blanchett.
Great, thanks, Mark. Let me share my screen here real quick, and we'll get started. So, can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. So a lot of the stuff that Mark just mentioned is stuff that I'm going to talk about. I've been geeking out on financial planning, I don't know, for 20 years. And to me, there's just always this question of like, how can we do it better, right? How can we improve the models that we use that are kind of the cornerstone of what we tell clients they should do? You know, how much do you have to save? When can you retire? How much you can spend? What is your portfolio risk level? All these things, to some extent, should be driven by the financial plan. And I guess I'm increasingly concerned that we're not doing the best job that we can. And so, today what I'm going to talk about are a variety of things. And, Mark mentioned this, but I would love for this to be interactive. Hopefully you guys can ask questions as we move through this. And maybe at some point, Mark's going to say, David, that's the dumbest thing I've heard today. You need to explain that more. But I'd like to make this interactive. I can talk for 20, 30 minutes if we want, or we can make this more Q&A. It's kind of up to you all. But like the goal is to really kind of talk about how I think a lot of the assumptions in retirement income projection tools really hasn't changed much over the last 20 or 30 years from kind of like a pure research perspective. I'll talk about the 4% rule. We all know the 4% rule, like literally it's 30 years old and we're doing the same thing most tools are today in terms of giving clients advice and guidance around a whole host of things. I'm going to walk through some models that I know work in a Monte Carlo projection that you could use to do this. And that's important because I'm going to make some points that a lot of the things that people talked about in research, I don't think are practical for real life. There's a whole host of reasons why, about the myriad of situations you have with clients, certain adaptive rules might not work in real life or might not do a very good job. I have to fully acknowledge that, unlike Mark, a lot of you all aren't building your own software tools. And so maybe you can't necessarily do this for your clients, but I think that you can maybe change the way that you think about the financial plan, the projection, change the way you convey information from it to your client. So that's kind of the goal. If you want to like super geek out on this topic, I have a paper that was published earlier this year, technically, that walks through this entire process. There's just a few fun formulas, a few ways to do things, but if you want to learn more, this is the best way to do it. I summarized it a few pieces for enterprising investor, but this is kind of the meat behind the article if you want to learn more. So,
David,
sure.
Is it practical for us to share that article and, for that matter, your slides for today. We had somebody had asked us if it would be willing to share the slides. We're happy to email them out if that's something you're comfortable with.
You got them. So I'll make sure that after right after we finish, Mark will send you the deck as well as this particular paper for those that didn't get enough of just the webinar.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. So let's talk about like things right now. Okay. So I'm terrible at like doing polls, but if I were to like ask how many people on this call do Monte Carlo, I'm going to guess it'd be over 80%. That's about the percentage that I typically see. I've done some surveys, others have done surveys. It's usually around 80%. There's obviously some factors related to usage of Monte Carlo. Younger advisors are more likely to use it than older advisors, all this stuff. I think what's really important is I'm a fan of this change. I'm a fan of this idea of embracing uncertainty, right? When I think about when I was doing financial plans, when I first got in this business 20 years ago, they were effectively deterministic, right? We assumed that the market went up every year by 7% or whatever the portfolio did, without this notion that that's probably not going to happen.
And so just to define for everybody, deterministic, we mean it was a static model.
Yeah.
As opposed to a simulation with having variation in paths and all that stuff.
Right. And to me, like people define Monte Carlo differently, right? So technically it's a model that has some form of randomness, right? So if you assume the stock market goes up the market goes up, the portfolio goes up 7% a year every year for 30 years, that's not like, there's no notion of randomness. And there's lots of ways that you can incorporate randomness into a projection. Like a point that I always make is that like Monte Carlo is infinite. There's like nothing that it can't do, okay? What we're limited by are the tools we use to deploy the methodology, right? So like I've heard advisors say, oh, I don't use Monte Carlo because it doesn't incorporate non-normal return distributions. One, I would say that's kind of a ridiculous critique if you're thinking about annual periods, but that's not true. Like you can specify the return distribution however you want to if it's your tool. Now, if you're using someone else's tool, you're limited to whatever inputs they may allow. But what's really important about Monte Carlo, it is infinite. It can do like whatever you want it to do if you can actually build the program.
Let's differentiate, because academically I completely agree with you, and I've worked with some really sophisticated multi-factor Monte Carlo simulations that used an entire volatility surface and skew and really complex stuff that would run overnight on huge computers. Mm-hmm. That's not the same type of Monte Carlo that advisors have access to on a desktop. And so I think some of the critique is that they're thinking about the limitations in the typical advisor type Monte Carlo simulations, and that's because all software providers and model builders are always weighing out complexity versus usability.
Right.
And so you're academically completely right. Of course, a Monte Carlo can get into whatever intricacies, changing volatility, shifting between normal and log normal distributions, and all kinds of really nerdy stuff you and I could probably talk about for hours, but most people on this call probably don't care about.
Right.
But the reality is they got to deal with the constraints of what they have and what's usable and what's available at a reasonable price point too. That really sophisticated model that I used up on Wall Street was a 7-figure a year subscription. Advisors aren't using that.
Well, and to be honest, timing. So like I have been working with programmers to actively build tools for 15 years, and like it's just all these trade-offs, right? Like I'm convinced that like I want more sophisticated tools to be built, but like I don't think advisors want to wait 2 minutes to get an answer, and then I put in the wrong like savings rate. I gotta wait. No, I think to your point, like it is all about trade-offs. And I think what we are seeing now more of is tools are going to lean in and out of different things that they do, right? So some will be faster, some might have dynamic methodologies, but usually it's hard to do everything simultaneously and also be fast, at least in my experience. So I think that, again, like no poll here, but like the 4% rule, like we've all heard of the 4% rule. There's nothing new there. But what concerns me is the fact that like the underlying kind of research methodology behind it is kind of how most advisors still do financial plans today. They have like a 30-year retirement. They assume like effectively a fixed real or inflation adjusted goal, and they quantify the outcome using success rates. And that's problematic for like a host of issues. One of them is just kind of like structurally how the liability is defined, right? So the liability is, that's like a fancy way to call the retirement goal, right? So when we think about liabilities, so the kind of the largest body of research that I've seen out there on building portfolios to accomplish goals is usually for pension plans, and it's called LDI, or liability-driven investing. And in that framework, there's a hard liability, right? The pension plan does not have a choice; it has to pay out that benefit. Okay, I think what we've seen a lot of is people who have kind of ported this LDI perspective from pensions to people, but people are incredibly different than pensions, right? People have choice around how much they spend, and if they vary their spending, how they feel about it. Right, so certain people might be incredibly unwilling to vary their spending, others might be more willing to do so, and then as they vary it, like how they feel about it can be incredibly different, right? So like an example here,
I was going to say, there's also another really big fundamental difference between people and a pension, and that's the law of large numbers, right? In a big public pension, we don't know when anyone is going to die, but we know when they're all going to die, right? Nobody cares about the averages when it comes to themselves. If you're one singular person, or you're two people, maybe a couple, you care about your event. So we can't use the same statistical standards that we use if we say a pension is 100% funded. That works when you have 100,000 people. That doesn't work. That's sort of the equivalent in a financial planning setting of saying you have an exact 50% success rate. You're perfectly at the top. You're at the apex of that bell curve distribution. The best guess we have is you'll spend your last dollar on your last day on earth. That's our best guess. There's a 50% chance you'll outlive that last dollar expenditure, and there's a 50% chance you would have expired before that. In pension world, that's great. For personal financial planning, that's terrible. Nobody signs up for that.
Yeah, and people, there's just massive idiosyncratic risk, right? You don't know how long you're going to live. Might have a health shock, and so like retirement planning is very complicated, right? I think like for me, like a key issue is like, so how do people respond to changes, right? So think about, I'll make this point more than once, like success rates are a binary objective function. Either you succeed or you fail, right? Under that framework, if you just fall just a tiny bit short, like it suggests that you're devastated, right? So it's ones and zeros. Either you get all the goals of one, else zero. Okay, so here's a survey question. I've got more of these, where I asked 1,500 people, how would you feel about a 20% drop in your retirement lifestyle? Okay, if success rates were an accurate representation of how individuals respond to changes, 100% of them should have said I would be devastated, right? Not the case, right? In reality, a 20% drop, it matters, but it's not cataclysmic, right? And where this is really important is just people that have financial advisors are a lot wealthier than the average American. They have a significant portion of their expenditures that are flexible. They can choose to make, so the average American, whoever that might be, like doesn't necessarily have a lot of as much flexibility around spending. But everyone on this webinar is wealthier than average. Most likely they have clients that are very wealthy. The implied flexibility is massive, especially when you think about the role of the portfolio on top of existing guaranteed income. So to me here, the key is like, if you're using models that assume a client has a static goal and they're not willing to cut back, you're not going to accurately reflect like the way that their assets are being structured against their liabilities, especially given the fact that most Americans have Social Security or pension, and their savings are funding this kind of marginal liability around like needs and wants.
So for the higher socioeconomic demographic, they have more flexibility because we're way beyond food and shelter and clothing and the things that may be less flexible. But what's interesting is at the other end of the socioeconomic demographic, you have another phenomenon where a lot more of their retirement spending is covered by Social Security. Whereas, the wealthy, very little of their retirement spending is covered by Social Security. So in your example, the success or failure, that binary situation, there is still income from at least Social Security. Some people may be fortunate enough to have a pension or have some other guaranteed income source, but at a minimum, they have Social Security. So imagine if you live on $3,000 a month, but your Social Security is $2,500. If you run out of assets, you still have the $2,500, right? If your situation is you spend $10,000 a month, right, and 3/4 of your spending is supported by your assets, and you run out, that's a draconian change that's really difficult for people.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and I'll just skip to Fat Tony. So my favorite, most colorful example, like the only place that I can really think of where success rates like accurately capture an outcome is if you owe a loan shark, Fat Tony, $100,000 at noon tomorrow, okay? And if you don't have exactly that or more, like he's gonna kill you. Let's just work with me here because he's gonna kill you, okay? And so like in that example, you only exist in 2 states at noon. Either you're alive or you're dead, okay? And why that's really important is it would affect how you decide to make certain decisions, right? So let's just say that hypothetically, you're 2 minutes from his house. You only have $99,000. Okay, someone would say, I'll flip you a coin. If you get heads, I'll give you $1,000. If not, you lose everything. Okay, technically that would be a smart bet if it's your only way to get to $100,000, right? Because you only exist in 2 states, right? So like the issue there is that how we think about the outcome can affect what we would do to actually accomplish. Like that is like that coin flip has a terrible expected value, but if I can only be alive or dead, that's my only option to achieve that goal, then it actually would be rational to do so. But it's not for people that have this ability to adapt and make changes and kind of experience a continuous set of outcomes versus just these kind of like zeros and ones across trials. So I think like the key is, and you used the word adaptive earlier. I like the word dynamic. I don't know, same thing. But the problem is a lot of our models just assume that someone retires and they effectively make decisions and they don't make any changes. So like I kind of liken it to like they get in their car, they start the car, and they just put on a blindfold and they just start driving, right? Like they don't slow down if they're headed towards a cliff, or they don't speed up if they got wide open tracks ahead of them. But that's what they're going to do. Right, advisors who work with clients, I've talked about this a long time. Advisors say, David, I do dynamic planning, right? I go in every year and tell a client like what they can do, how much they can spend, all these different things. Okay, and what I tell them is like that's what you should be doing. The problem is if you don't model it, you don't reflect how those changes would affect decisions in the future. And the most important thing is how it affects decisions right now. Right, so if you acknowledge future states of change in the T+1, it changes your advice today around like a whole host of issues. So I get it, advisors are doing dynamic planning, but if you're doing dynamic planning using static models, you're not kind of capturing the value of those future changes you're going to make and how it would affect what you should be doing right now.
So in terms of dealing with the practicality of modeling these things, because I think conceptually we can all wrap our arms around the notion that if the economy has gone south, people by and large tend to tighten their belts. Right. We see that. We see it in retail spending data. So that I think there's clear evidence of that behavior. I think the $64,000 question is, how do you model it? Do you attempt to do it while someone's working as well, which does tend to be reality? It's not just a phenomenon for retirees. And I'm very curious to hear how you would approach the practicality of something rules-based, we'll call it a rule of thumb, as to how we think behaviors will change relative to those economic scenarios. Because it's not an easy problem.
No, and the thing is, there are no right answers, because any projection that lasts 30 or 40 years is guaranteed to be wrong, right? Especially the ones that last 70. So I mean, like again, like I embrace the uncertainty. I think the key to me is like, so just for example, a lot of research, mine included, on annuities asks this question: how much should you annuitize upon retirement? Okay, well, that answer changes dramatically when I allow you to annuitize not only upon retirement, but also in future states in retirement as your situation evolves, right? So this decision of what you should do, it will depend upon like the rules. So like, I don't know if I might have taken on this deck, like I have some basic rules that you can use to employ, but in reality, like you can get really wild with this dynamic rule. You could change portfolios, withdrawal rates, age of retirement, a whole host of things that I think is just a step in the right direction away from like a purely static forecast. Because like this is what happens in static forecasts. So on the left is a static withdrawal projection the last 30 years, right? What you see is the outcomes diverge over time, because I'm going to keep taking out that $30,000 a year no matter what happens, right? So certain runs where you have this massive bear market, it assumes you just keep doing it. That's ridiculous, right? If the markets go up 20% a year for 10 years, it assumes that you stay on that same path. Like neither of those are accurate in terms of how you should be responding, because to me, this is all about trade-offs, right? Most retirees are constrained to some extent. They're having to make choices about how they're going to, shift consumption across their lifetime. So what I want to show someone is how do you kind of better balance this, right? How do you say, hey, like there's some research that came out, I don't know, like a year ago, it was talking about how 2% is the new 4% when it comes to safe withdrawal rates, right? And
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I wanted you to go. I let you finish. When you finish, I wanted you to go back to that last slide for a minute too. But finish.
Let's go. There we go. All right, you go. Good.
First baseline question: is inflation a factor in this, or is this when you say static withdrawal, the same? Okay, so perhaps I'm not reading the illustration right, but clearly a lot more variance on the left. But why do we see in 30 years visually what looks like the average balance is much lower with the dynamic withdrawals? I wouldn't have.
You spend a lot more. So like this is balance. I mean, I should have like a complement, which is income, right? But like the static, if you've ever done like a Monte Carlo to assume static withdrawals, like, and you look at like the distribution, like you achieve the goal and then you go broke, and then across percentiles. Well, dynamic, it actually looks like this, right? So this is what it looks like if you do a dynamic projection for income, where like what you would have here normally is like just a flat line through the entire length of retirement for static. This is in real income. Dynamic, though, it has this kind of like blossoming out. It like the income is diverging, because it assumes you're making adjustments as you evolve through retirement.
So what rules were in place in this illustration as to how the dynamic withdrawal change? Is it a certain portion is related to the balance, meaning stock market, bond market, some kind of return?
So I don't think I get into the weeds in this one, but like in the paper, how you have to do it is using a funded ratio calculation. So all the assets divided by all the liabilities, and assets is holistic. So it's the net present value of all expected inflows and assets divided by all the expected outflows. And like why you need a holistic metric is like some like guardrail rules use returns. Well, even if your portfolio is going down in value, if you have this massive inflow coming in 10 years, that's going to affect your overall economic situation. So I think to do it correctly, to do it rationally, you need to be looking at each year of each run and estimate how their situation is kind of evolving over time.
The challenge I find in that, while conceptually totally agree, and we produce funded levels, as one of our prime visualization tools. The challenge that I find in modeling this dynamic withdrawal is that gets back to, well, what if you're doing it while someone's working? They're still accumulating, right? So in other words, if the younger person has a smaller savings, a smaller balance, yes, at that moment they have not funded a large portion of their retirement, which is okay, because as they continue to work and save, they are achieving that. But what we find is you can't say, well, as the balance fluctuates up and down, we're going to adjust what you spend, because that's not very relevant while somebody's still accumulating. You can do it. You can do it once they've retired. If you get to a point where you say, we are not putting any more money in, this is the nest egg. And so now we could say, well, there's a portion that we're going to withdraw that are the needs, right? There's the non-discretionary portion that's going to come out, and it's going to fluctuate with inflation perhaps, but maybe not with the economy. Then you have this wants and desires or whatnot, your wish list, and that you could say could be certainly correlated. Whether completely or partially correlated to the balance. But how do you handle it before they retire?
So I think that retirement is like a mirage that you move increasingly away from as you age. Like I don't believe that if you're 45 years old, for example, the retirement goal should have a meaning. Your expectations around retirement should have any kind of meaningful impact on your portfolio, because you don't have any idea what you're going to want to do or spend or be or happen in 20 years. And so when I think about like how to determine, like efficient portfolios for a 45-year-old, it's actually a very different model than someone who is at or closer in retirement, because like the goal is more real. Like the goal is always kind of, you don't know what it's going to be, but like I have a harder time, saying, hey, I'm going to assume that you cut back, on your balance or your goal at age of 45 when I don't know what it's going to be. So I like this. I use this to adjust rules like in and through retirement when I have a better sense of the retirement income goal. I don't like it as much for someone who is 25 years old.
We find advisors share the feedback all the time that while every planning tool, including ours, which is in the risk assessment space, everyone asks the question, when will you retire?
Yeah.
Right. Staple question. And if you're, as you said, if you're getting close, people are laser focused on this.
Right.
For someone earlier in their career, routinely they tell the advisor, I don't know the answer. Right. I'm forced to enter something, right? Because your Monte Carlo doesn't calculate if we don't enter the answer to that question. But they don't really know the answer. Right. One of the ways we address it in our funded level chart is we actually compute the funded level with varying stages of retirement. So we actually compute it without the answer to that question, which is kind of elegant because, especially with younger people, they just simply don't know.
Yes, I mean, I think there needs to be like smart defaults for everything. One thing I've actually done research on is retirement age should actually probably be a stochastic variable, because there's like a negative error. People retire 3 years earlier on average than they expect to do so. And so what I'll often see is advisors have a client, the client wasn't on track at 65, so they're going to work till they're 70. No, they're not. Like, they're really not going to do that. Like, there's things happen. And so I think that you should be looking at other levers versus retirement age, because there is this negative error where people retire 2 or 3 years earlier on average, especially as you delay retirement past, say, 62 in real life.
And I will bet you, although I cannot prove this, maybe you have the data to prove it, but I will bet you have this bimodal distribution, right? They are more likely to retire 3 years earlier because the economy boomed and they were able to, or because the economy was lousy and they were kind of forced into it. Look at what happened in the last, cycle or 2 cycles. We saw a lot of people who when unemployment spiked couldn't get back into the workforce. They eventually stopped looking, and that created that 3-year deficit as well. And by and large, they were just forced to reduce their lifestyle in retirement as a counterbalancing feature.
Yeah, I mean, early retirement is not usually a choice. It's something that happens to you. It's an involuntary layoff. It's a health issue for you or your spouse or something else. So I think that's what people don't see is they say, oh, I'm going to be fine. Well, it's really hard to predict, like the economy 3 years out. And to your point, people do tend to retire just before markets kind of go into that bear market. So there really is kind of some bad timing historically for retirees. So I've kind of talked about this, like success rates, like they really, the issue with success rates increasingly is just the increased life expectancies among wealthier Americans, right? So this is like if for those of you watching, like is this a failure? Like, so this person in the 30th year of retirement fell like, I don't know, $10,000 short, but in almost all the runs, they got all the way there, right? I don't think it is, right? And this is like my best example about why you can be led astray by success rate. So on this slide, the goal is $100 a year for 10 years. Okay, if you see red, it means there's a shortfall. So in the first run or trial, in the 10th year of the trial, they fall $10 short. Okay, so you can see here that because there's red in 5 of the trials, they have a 50% success rate. They accomplished their goal 50% of the time. Okay, but they accomplished 96% of their goal on average. Okay, both of these statistics are based off the same exact data set, right? How does a normal human respond to either one of these? If I were to tell you have a 50% success rate, you'd be like, oh my God, like that's terrible. Like, what do I need to do to kind of improve things? Like, But if I tell you, on average, you accomplish 96% of your goal, well, that's spectacular.
Do you, in examples like this, does it presume that there's a certain, in the red cells, the assets are gone, but there's another income source that's covering
Social
this
Security.
portion?
Sure.
Okay.
Or you've cut back, or you've cut back, right? Because the problem, right, is where this actually happens in a Monte Carlo with static assumptions is in the 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th year of retirement.
Right.
And so I think to me, like, the key here is just how we can conveying outcomes to clients. Like, I'm really against like telling someone that they have an X% success rate, 50%, 80%, because no matter what you tell someone, if it's not 100%, it introduces fear like into their perceptions on the outcome. And so like I believe like we need to just you map success rates if you have to some kind of more like qualitative assessment, like there's the you're really screwed zone, you're kind of screwed zone, you're in good shape, and you're in great shape, and that's all you tell a client. I fundamentally believe that telling clients success rates does not result in better outcomes. Just tell them they're on track and come back again next year.
I'm going to disagree with you on this one.
All right.
Okay. I understand your reasoning, and I don't disagree with your reasoning, by the way. And maybe it's because I'm a big math nerd. I gravitate to the statistics. But here's what I have found. I have found that people, including advisors, will ask, what's the right answer to that probability of success or failure? And I would argue, and I think a lot of advisors argue, 100% success is actually not the ideal situation, because what that implicitly means is that somebody's living so conservatively relative to their resources, they're not enjoying the journey as much as they could. And so what we find, we color code these. We actually don't call it success or failure. Because we incorporate all these other dynamic features, including dynamic lifespan, we're not just running it for a certain period. We measure the probability that client A or spouse, client A or B, in a sense, one spouse or the other, would outlive their money, outlive their assets, right? So a little bit different than the classic representation. But we color code it where a 10% chance that one or both of you would outlive your assets or less is color-coded green. And it's color-coded green because most people find that pretty acceptable. Above 30% failure, 30% chance one or both outlive their assets, we color-code red because very few people find it acceptable. The yellow range, the 10 to 30% range, is where we find there's a lot of disagreement, a lot of opinions, both clients and advisors, as to what is the right answer. And I'll tell you, just on a personal note, I lost my childhood best friend when we were 43 years old. Not everybody makes it to retirement. And unfortunately, by the time you make it to my age, you've lost more than one. Life is about balance. And I think a lot of advisors subscribe to this. And boy, look at all the crazy things going on in the world over the last number of years. I think that caused a lot of people to do a lot of reflecting. And so I don't think having a less than 1% chance of running out of money is actually the best answer, because it means you're living so conservatively. Right. So there isn't a categorical right answer to the question. And so conceptually, I think you and I agree about this. I think, to me, I'm still comforted by having some numbers, by framing it. Although I acknowledge, and many advisors acknowledge, there isn't a categorical right answer or wrong answer.
I have to have numbers because I need to like objectively solve to something. So like on this slide, like, so there's a paper that talked about like 2% is the new 4% because they assume retirement lasts like 40 years. And these are 99% success rate, right? Well, what that's assuming is that you're okay eating cat food for your entire life under this like 0.001% chance that you're still alive and you can't make a change in 40 years. And that, like, so to me, like, that's the key here. It's this idea of trade-offs. It's how do individuals respond? I mean, to me, like, people invest in stocks, right? Stocks can actually go down in value. Did we know this? We do. But you do it because you expect to earn a higher return, right? So like all throughout our lives, everything we do, we make trade-offs. If you exercise, don't exercise. Do you buy insurance? You're always weighing the costs and benefits. Like, what I want is to kind of better convey, I guess maybe first, like where people fall in terms of an outcome. So like I would advocate, like, as opposed to telling someone that they have like a 57% success rate, like tell them like what it actually means if they don't accomplish their goal. So tell them, in the worst 1 in 10 scenarios at age 95, you're going to have $50,000 a year in today's income. How does that make you feel? Right? That is a far more useful statistic than a success rate, because it conveys like when the bad thing happens, like what are the actual implications on your lifestyle.
It's all predicated on the rules, right? To be able to compute that in your other slide, 96%, or in this one, 90%, it's all predicated on the rules about how you'll adjust your spending in those environments.
But yeah, even like dumb rules, but even very basic rules like modified RMD, like 1 over some estimate of retirement period, is better than just assuming that you follow a path like blindly, right? So I mean, to me, like the key is not like perfection's a waste of time given the massive amount of estimation error in these forecasts. It's giving someone, the retiree, a useful context of the trade-offs. And so like my concern with success rates is that it doesn't provide context on like magnitude of failure, right? So your goal is $100,000 a year, you get 95K from Social Security and pensions. Who cares if you fail, right? You got all your goal, right? So like what I care about is telling someone, hey, like when the bad stuff happens, using reasonable assumptions around what you might be doing, what does that mean for your lifestyle? And that's where I think success rates kind of go wrong, because they totally ignore the magnitude of failure, right? So then like another point I make is like, I think 80% to me is the right target for, on average, if you're doing a Monte Carlo focus on an outcome. Again, it varies, but like when you think about the nuances around like the structure of liabilities, like what it means to actually fail, like I think if you're over 80%, I would be more than comfortable telling someone like you're on track. Now the rebuttal here, if I say I can't tell someone they have a 20% failure rate, well, you don't tell them the statistic. You use it to figure out where they are, and then you convey their situation qualitatively based upon this quantitative value.
So we have a feature where the advisor can choose that threshold, where an on-screen, we'll call it warning, it doesn't say the word warning, but where it says your probability of outliving your money is above X, and the advisor can set that. And we do find 20% is probably the most popular setting, just to validate your premise.
I don't know if they pick a different number, it would invalidate. But to me, the key here is people want. I understand why you want 100%, why people would want to have 100%, or 0%, whatever whether you don't fail. Like the key is there's a cost there, right? And if the model doesn't assume like dynamic changes, and it sounds like you use stochastic mortality. Most tools don't do that. Like I don't want someone to not enjoy retirement because we're using like incredibly overly conservative assumptions around.
Well, yeah, that's another great point. Because most tools are not doing that, and advisors tend to want to err on the conservative side because we don't know how long somebody's going to live. So you routinely find advisors choose a very high ending point for that simulation. Number one, because they don't know, there's an uncertainty, of course. And number two, often they're working with 2 people. So statistics tell us that if you've got 2 bites at the apple, right, the chance that somebody makes it to an advanced age goes up considerably, almost double. So that makes some sense, but it means that the probability of success ends up being skewed by that. Right. Now, one of the advantages of using dynamic lifespan is we can remove that. The challenge for us, interestingly, is in sort of the re-education, right? Advisors who are used to using, I'm going to put in 95 or 100 or something. Boy, if you put that into Talarisk with second to die or last survivor probabilities that we calibrate to that entry, that ends up being uber conservative. And right. So some of it for us is about sort of adjusting the way advisors think about it so as to remove that sort of forced level of conservatism.
I mean, to me, it's kind of funny. Like I mentioned, like Monte Carlo is infinite, but the only random variable in most of our models is returns. Like there's so much other random stuff out there that could happen, right?
So that's because advisors are used to what's called a single factor Monte Carlo simulation, right? You can have a 2 and a 3 factor Monte Carlo, but the computational intensiveness is exponentially increased. So a 3 factor Monte Carlo simulation, a true 3 factor, meaning it's 3 different random variables, perhaps with some covariance, that's a voluminous computational construct to do really well. And so that's why you don't see that on a desktop that's meant to compute in seconds. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I so like to me, it's just you can just increase the runs, right? It's how you introduce the random variables. I mean, and I understand it too. Like I use random mortality in my research, but it's really hard to convey like random returns in my experience and random mortality even to relatively sophisticated advisors or investors, because they're like it hurts their mind, I think, too much today.
It's interesting. I have found advisors like the fact that lifespan is dynamic. They often say they don't like handing over some financial plan and saying, here's your financial plan as long as you keep your 60-40 portfolio, you both die on someone's 90th birthday, and inflation's 3% every year. Like, they don't like the caveats. And what they routinely say is, my client might not want to be mired in the weeds, but they're also not stupid. And so it's easier for them to acknowledge the uncertainties. We don't know how long you're going to live. We don't know what you will be drawing from this portfolio in 5 or 10 or 25 years, but we can account for the variance. And so at least when we give you some response, even if it's a number, I know you'd rather categories, but even if somebody gives them the number, at least it's paying deference to the uncertainties that life presents. And I think that's been a balance that a lot of advisors seem to appreciate.
Well, and to me, like, I got some data a while back on like the end ages people are using in plans, and like there's very little variation at all, and then that bothers me. Like, I get it, if you have an unhealthy or healthy client, they have different lifespans, but like, and you want to be conservative, but like if you have an unhealthy smoker and a healthy non-smoker, there's like a 10+ year age gap difference there. So you can still like estimate, assuming you're not doing a dynamic mortality, a point along the curve that is conservative for both. But if you are truly unhealthy and you smoke, like, you actually can probably spend more in retirement. Like, that's just the way that it works. I would want to communicate that effectively versus being way too conservative and not incorporating that person's kind of unique health situation into the actual plan.
I wrote a piece a few years ago that was my attempt at starting a new genre of comedy for financial planners. And the essence of it was that you had this advisor who would make the same recommendations every time, right? You got to spend less, you got to work longer, you got to downsize, and people were tired of hearing it. And he was working with a client, Joe Schmo, and noticed that this guy has a heavy smoking habit, and of course ran the effective lifespan and accounted for those mortality distributions, and said, well, his financial plan looks great. What if I could replicate this success? And so he turns to the next client that says, don't you have a better answer, Mr. or Mrs. Advisor? And he says, well, have you thought about taking up smoking?
Smoking, yeah, smoking really will do wonders for your lifespan, right?
Well, it really fixed the financial plan. So
it really can. just start smoking and stop exercising and eat whatever you want, and you're gonna find your success rate goes way up, right?
Way up, right?
Well, so I'll just wrap things up because I know we're low on time. I think people have said, like, well, like, if you do this stuff, if you do dynamic modeling, like, how does it affect outcomes? And the one thing that I found is pretty unequivocal is it does result in higher portfolio withdrawal rates, so higher levels of spending, right? When you acknowledge flexibility, you acknowledge change, like this idea of 4% is safe. Well, 4% is like the minimum, probably. Like, I think 5% or 6% is a better starting point when you acknowledge kind of the holistic balance sheet around, the composition of assets and liabilities. I think that people can spend more almost universally when you incorporate dynamic rules into a forecast. It tend to suggest higher risk levels. This actually isn't always the case. It's based upon the client situation, but it is kind of ambiguous on guaranteed income. When you acknowledge, I think, some of the benefits around economically and behaviorally around providing that certainty, I think it leads to higher recommendations to fund kind of more essential spending, and lower recommendations for the more flexible stuff. But I'll stop there. I don't know. Go ahead.
I was going to say, what we find is, from a mathematical perspective, for somebody that has some guaranteed income stream, whether it's Social Security or something beyond that, all else equal, if they cover more of their retirement spending with guaranteed income, that increases their ability to take risk on their other assets. And so it's, if you have somebody with good longevity, whether they're female, they have good lifestyle habits, good family history, if they're lucky enough to have that, good health, and you combine that with the greater ability to take risk on their other assets, the combination can be powerful. Now, you can go overboard too. If somebody moves all the assets into some guaranteed for life income stream, that may literally just be too conservative to account for the inflationary impact over a long retirement span. So there's definitely some balance in that.
Yeah, and to be honest, there is, by definition, when you do mortality risk pooling, you can increase, withdrawal rates. I think there's also this important behavioral component where it's easier to deplete wealth when you're less concerned about outliving it and market returns and all that. So I know that annuities are kind of a hot topic where individuals have kind of strong perspectives, but I really do think that more Americans need solutions that are longevity protected, because it just radically simplifies things that advisors cannot control for. You cannot provide certainty around lifetime income from a portfolio, especially in the absence of some kind of longevity pool. So I think this is enough for slides. I don't know if you have any questions that came in at all, but I think it's safe to say I'll show you my disclosures here for a hot second so no one gets me in trouble. But I'm good in terms of the content. So.
Yeah, one of the questions was, and I'm going to paraphrase. We have a couple. I think what they're asking is, what or how do you presume expenses decline associated with a decline in markets, which I think is directionally what you're suggesting. So are you assuming it's 1-for-1 on the discretionary portion of spending, or is there some other sort of relationship that you use as sort of a rule of thumb?
So you can do, there's tons of things you can do here that vary along the range of complexity. But I mean, what I typically employ are different rules where the adjustments vary based upon whether it's a needs goal or a wants goal, where a wants goal, you would adjust spending more quickly as the funded ratio changes. Needs would be a lot slower, especially on the upside. So I think that there's so you can have complex grids based upon funded ratio and portfolio returns and years left and all that. To me, I think that structurally, if I'm going to make a change, I'm going to make a change faster to wants versus needs, and I'm more willing to increase wants if things start going well than I am needs.
I actually think, and this is my question, and then we have others as well, but I think it's really important for an advisor to understand the rule that's either implicit in the software or maybe the one that they are choosing in the software, because they have to counsel the client. In other words, they're going to be with that client in that next economic downturn. So being able to counsel the client on, hey, this is what we planned. You were spending $10,000 a month, but here's what happened, and we had planned for you to drop to X. I think the advisor needs to be able to articulate that. And so I think as a software industry or as academics, I think we need to provide that kind of guidance and education, because it could be modeled brilliantly. Mm-hmm. But if the advisor can't articulate in a real world situation how the client's behavior should change, I'm not sure it solves the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Maybe I'm a little different in that I think you could actually have a really, I think complex models are fine, but you have to have ways to communicate them simply to a client. So you could have a robust matrix of possibilities, but say, hey, in this modeling tool, there's 3 different adjustment factors. There's fast, medium, and slow. And fast is if your portfolio goes down by 10%, you would adjust your spending by X. And so I think there's ways that you can simplify really kind of robust approaches in ways that they're understandable. But at the same time, I wouldn't expect an advisor to build that complex matrix of adjustments within the model.
So we have another question, which is, what software do you feel is best for projections? So I guess that's projections on, I'm not sure if that's projections on spending. I think that's perhaps what that is.
I don't know. I think, again, the only one that I've heard of that does a decent job is Income Lab. They have a dynamic adjustment tool. I mean, it sounds like you guys do it too. So I honestly don't know what's out there. And then even I don't know how they work under the hood, right? So to your point, you can have dynamic models. Is it based upon success rates or more complex measures? So I'm not sure what's out there, but I know that most of the largest providers, Money Guy Pro, et cetera, they're still very much entrenched in, fixed period, static models, and success rates.
So we, just for full disclosure, so we vary it based on inflation. So we're accounting for the fact that we don't know what future expenses are, but we're not doing it based on the value of the portfolio. We've been batting around this idea for a few years now, and in concept we're on the same page. And maybe we overthink it, and maybe that's held us back from implementing something. But we haven't quite come up with what we think is that right balance of doing it in a robust way, but a simple enough way for the advisor to control it. The advisor still has to make certain assumptions, and they have to be able to explain it to the client. So we've not given up on this pursuit, but I don't want to mislead our listeners into thinking we have something out of the box that does this. Not yet. Do we have any other questions for David? I've been sort of relaying them and combinations of them as we go. I think that might be it. Okay. So thank you so much, David. This was a lot of fun. A lot of fun for me. I hope for you as well. We got lots of great feedback on the dialogue. We certainly would love to have you back next year on whatever the newest and latest topic you'll be working on. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. So thank you so much for being here, everybody that's with us. Thank you for joining us. And again, from the Talerist team, if you'd like more information, we're going to send out David's slides and the white paper that he mentioned. And if you'd like to take a look at our latest and greatest technology, we're happy to give you a proper tour at your convenience. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.